This is Duke University.
The way it started was Scott and I and our friend Laura were talking about Rick Powers' book. And it's an unusual book in that it, as Rick does with everything that he writes, has a great deal of expertise about a particular topic. And in this case, the topic was a contemporary American composer. And the more I read this book, the more I realized there was an affinity between the kind of attitude towards composition that Rick writes about in his main character and some of the stuff that Scott was excited about in his own work. And from there, the idea hatched that we could put together some kind of performance where we brought these wonderful, eloquent words about what it is to be a composer today with an actual performance of a piece that was commissioned from Scott, who in turn would be kind of inspired by having read Rick's book and the ideas there. And then the other half of the idea was that contained in Orfeo is this wonderful kind of set piece, which narrates the origins of this wonderful 20th century masterpiece, Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time. And in the course of this narration, Rick goes through how the piece was conceived in a concentration camp in 1941, and then each movement in turn is sort of dealt with very wonderfully. So to put that together with a performance of the piece so that the audience could experience and hear about the origins of the piece and then hear sort of the author's take on each individual movement seemed like a wonderful kind of piece of theater or hybrid theater and performance to put together. So that's where it started, and really it's been a collaboration. No one is really directing this. We developed a concept, and then each person did their part. And what you will see on Sunday is really something that can't be fully described until you hear it. So I hope many of you will come to that. But I don't know if you want to talk about your involvement.
Sure. I think one of the things that really strikes me about this project is that, I mean, the idea of having readings with music in itself is not unusual. I often find myself in those settings somewhat distracted, by the music pulling in one direction and the readings pulling in a different direction, and that it's not exactly diluting the impact, but it as I said, I would be somewhat distracted by that. What's so amazing to me about this project is that Rick's writings are so beautifully tuned to the pieces that you're about to hear. They prime your imaginations with images, affects, ideas, anecdotes, histories about the Quartet for the End of Time, and for my piece, just what it's like to be a composer, the way a composer sees and hears the world and translates that, it might translate that into music. And so rather than distracting, it actually amplifies the impact of the music by giving you these things to hang on to as the piece begins. So even for the Messiaen, which is a piece I've known for like 35 years, it was like hearing it all over again, hearing it for the first time because of these beautiful frames that Rick constructs with his text, and just really deepened the experience of the music for me. So that was a wonderful discovery, as we put this project together and we began rehearsing it with the texts and interleaving the texts with the performance. My piece, I mean, I've been a fan of Rick's books, for a long time, and of course was thrilled when Orfeo came out and saw that a composer was the protagonist, and not only that, a composer who is really engaged in experimental music as it was taking hold in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, and he describes that world. Talking to him as if he's not here, but Rick paints this picture with.
I'm nodding and thinking, I must be on after this guy.
Yeah. It's just the insight that he brings in the way that he paints the picture of that world, describing not only the scene and the kind of excitement about this sort of work and the sort of social dynamics involved. I came of age a little bit later than that, not much later than that, but it was the type of thing where it was somewhat polarized. You know, you're either going to get on board with this program or you're not with it, so to speak. And those dynamics are very much, you know, something that I think Peter Els, the composer, the protagonist, deals with. And I certainly felt that, you know, when I was studying in music school way back when, that there was this this fork in the road that you had to determine. But what I love so much about this character is that, you know, for him, you know, he's at the end of his of his creative life, and you know, it's how all this artistic experience accumulates over time, and he doesn't disavow any of it. You know, he takes full ownership of what he did when he was really involved with the experimental art. He takes ownership of those early experiences of music that are very almost, you know, precognitive, this kind of direct, effective engagement with music, and it was all part of his own life, and that really inspired me because it prompted me when I began working on this piece, Cadences, to try to write something that encapsulated or brought together all the different things I'd been interested in my career as a composer. So there are some things that are, for me, rather speculative and somewhat experimental, other things that are more straightforward and you know, conventional. And whereas in the past I would have worried about, well, is this coherent to have all these mixed in the same piece? I just didn't care. I just wanted to let them all collide with each other and see if it made sense to you know, to the musicians and hopefully, you know, to the audience. And it was just such a joyful experience, you know, to write the piece. It's like the book gave me permission in a way to think in this way. More concretely, though, you know, in terms of the specific influence from Rick's book, is that you know, his prose is beautiful. It has the kind of rhythm of it, the prosody of his writing is something that I think is very special, and it creates a particular space that the book inhabits and that I just want to live in, you know, while I read it. And so I thought, well, you know, I could do something that's somewhat programmatic, and there's maybe a tiny bit of that in the piece, but what I really responded to is the text itself. And so I recorded myself reading passages from the book, and I transcribed the rhythms of that speech, and then I wrote music that used those rhythms, you know, played instrumentally. So the text disappears, and then I manipulate the rhythms so the text actually becomes unintelligible if you were to try to find how it actually maps to his words, to Rick's words. But that was thrilling, actually, to explore. And it also makes for, as Laura and Jonathan will say, a rather tricky piece to play because these speech rhythms don't necessarily fall into you know, clear beats and metrical patterns at the outset. Right. And yet, to my delight, you know, as the piece came together, they play it with such buoyancy and grace that you can almost hear it sound like spoken utterance, and have an effortless, seemingly effortless flow to those phrases that are constructed this way. So it was just a real. There was a lot of excitement for me as I was working on the piece, and then to see it come together in the context of Rick's readings, and then setting up the quartet for the end of time. It's just been really, really remarkable for me. And so again, I mean, if you're going to be there, hopefully if you can be there on Sunday, you'll get some sense of what I'm talking about.
You know, for me, the joy is absolutely complementary. I am a frustrated musician myself. I think had I been good enough, I probably would have tried to walk the walk. Of the 11 novels that I've written, 3 of them have taken some aspect of music as their direct subject. And the fact that I keep coming back, you know, every 4 books or so, is testimony to the fact that, you know, what I really would have loved to spend my years doing is making music. And to write a book about music, although everyone tells you not to, right? Was it Steve Martin? Someone said writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And to some extent it's true. And you know, there is a refrain in the book: music is not about things. It is a thing, yes. Right? And any attempt to paraphrase or explicate through some other medium is going to vitiate that immediate being. But it's just I can't resist it. It's a marvelous temptation, and it means that for 3 or 4 years I get to justify spending many hours a day listening to music. I get to justify writing off CDs on my income tax, right? Which is a questionable practice that probably qualifies me to run for president at this point. But the joy of the book was not only to take a dozen or so pivotal works of the 20th century and try to weave them into a personal narrative, but to create a lot of fictional music and to try to describe the fictional music in the same way that I describe the existing palpable pieces that you can get 20 or 30 recordings of and listen to. So to have done that, to have spent those years imagining this aesthetic journey of this fellow who, as Scott says, goes through all the revolutions of his day, all the, up on the barricades and the subsequent repudiations, the repenting, all of that, and to make each piece, to describe it in a way that the reader can almost say, wow, I want to get a hold of a recording of that. I want to listen to that piece. To have done all that for that length of time, and then to have an actual work of music being produced in response to this guy's life and this guy's crises and this guy's dramatic interior conflicts and his aesthetic obsessions, that's the best payoff I can think of. And I had the opportunity. I guess what we did was a kind of live dress with audience up in New Hampshire, and I sat in on an early rehearsal when the players were still struggling with these complex speech rhythms and these abrupt changes into extremely different kinds of aesthetic regions, and I thought, this is going to be really interesting. And then when these incredible players, like Geppetto, reach out and touch the little wooden doll, and it turns into a human being, and it starts living. That for me was so thrilling to be up on stage, next to these players as they brought this piece to life that has at least some of the DNA of my imaginary guy. All that vicarious desire to be a musician had a little bit of real world payoff.
One of the passages that Rick reads before, actually the passage that he reads before Scott's piece is played, which is at the beginning of the concert, is one where he talks about music being in everything, in the leaves that grow on trees, in the cracks in the ice, in the splashing of water. And I love that because, I often have to stand up before a concert and explain to the audience why they should like this piece, or try to. Especially with contemporary music, audiences tend to want a little bit of a way in. And there was once a review by the music critic of the New York Times, Zachary Wolfe, and it began in this way. Whenever a musician stands up to speak before a concert, my heart sinks. And that actually is a problem because rarely do the words and does the explanation rise to the level of the music which you're trying to explain. And so it's a questionable exercise. We do it anyway. But here you have in this passage you have a wonderful imagination of an explanation, really, of the possibilities of the art and the way a composer actually might think about what music can be, because that's the journey that this Peter Els is on. And it also happened that Scott is very similarly inclined. I mean, you use biological
yeah, I've had projects that try to do that and see if I can find music in those numbers or whatever, or those quantities, and see if I can make it into music in some way. It's an ongoing interest of mine.
So it was kind of a nice pairing of imaginary, of fictional character and actual composer.
And we had interesting response up in New Hampshire too. We had people come up afterwards saying, I'm in that guilty group that leaves at intermission before the 20th century or the 21st century piece, gets performed.
It's never played after intermission,
That's
that.
Right.
We figured that.
But people saying, oftentimes when I go to hear a contemporary piece, it's purely an aesthetic experience. And either I have an instantly effective, attraction to that aesthetic, or I don't, and I sit there trying to make it happen. But these people were saying to have this triangulation, this kind of stereoscopic quality is to turn what would otherwise be a purely aesthetic experience into one that has a slightly narrative component, has a political component, has a historical or cultural component to it, that allows another point of entry into the music.
Right.
Absolutely.
So that was very gratifying. That there's an additive quality rather than a competitive one.
Right, and it also stimulates the listener in a different way when you have some words to think about, something to prepare you, and especially something that challenges you a little bit, rather than just lay something out that's easy to explain. But this passage that you read is kind of a fantasia, I like to think of it. So, it's kind of sets, I'm telling you what I think should happen when you go to the concert. Whether it actually happens, I don't know. But I love the idea that the audience will sit down, and first thing that they'll hear in this is this kind of challenging challenge to them about what they can imagine music to be, and then you hit them with the music. So they're getting hit, from the verbal side intellectually, and then they're being hit emotionally by the music at the same time. And to me, that makes very exciting art when you can do that.
It definitely made the audience more sympathetic, I think, and receptive to the music as for a piece that they've never heard before. So, I mean, it's great when people say afterwards, "Oh, I wanted to hear it again," right away, which that's gold for a composer, right? But I think a lot of that was because of the way the piece was, queued up by the text.
It's interesting when a reader tells you, I wanted to read it again right away. It sends a different message sometimes. But the other thing that happens with the Messiaen is, here you have this piece, and it gets played a fair amount, right? Yeah. As an extremely, a 50-minute, extremely demanding on the players and on the listeners, piece of somewhat abstract music. But if you are hearing the story of the genesis of the piece, Messiaen in this camp in the winter of 1940 as a prisoner of war, who can't keep his fingers warm enough to write the music, and the German commanding officer who just wants to hear what this French composer can do, somehow acquiring music paper and pens and putting him in solitary confinement so he can write this piece, and then performing this in a barrack in this Stalag in the middle of Silesia, while snow is blowing in through the doors and the windows. If you're hearing that story while hearing the piece, you're simultaneously consuming the piece as a listener in the 21st century and somehow participating in the recreation of its premiere. And even for me to be next to the players while that was happening and to have that historical superimposition, it's a different experience.
Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah.
It's not the same thing as hearing the Messiaen by itself, but but it's wonderful.
Or in the book, where you just I take pages to try to describe this dramatically and narratively, and then have to do a little bit of program musicology in the margins to try to make the music audible. There it is, and you've said that your piece is in some way in conversation with the Messiaen as well.
I've always adored his music, and so there are technical things. I mean, this is actually the other thing I admire about Orfeo is that Rick, he writes about music technically, and as well, he's getting into the nuts and bolts of what composers actually do when they're trying to figure out how to structure a phrase or dealing with patterns and interacting patterns, and most oftentimes when you read that in a novel, it's a disaster. We wince, but he gets it right.
Unless it's Thomas Mann who's getting Adorno to write the passage.
That's
for
right.
him.
That's right. He has a proxy.
He gives it to a musicologist.
But But it doesn't stay at a dry technical level. He invests that it becomes metaphorical in some way. He takes something like a rhythmic cycles that are taking place in the Messiaen, independent rhythmic cycles that go out of sync with each other, and it would take how many hours, for them to come into sync, and uses that as a meditation on time, and for a piece it's called the Quartet for the End of Time. So how he's able to link some of the nuts and bolts of the piece to these larger images it's amazing, and that's throughout the book, and something that I so much responded to, and as I was composing. So there's a tiny bit of programmatic stuff in my piece at the very end, where the character is being surrounded and chased down, and he's about to be caught, and my music sort of has this moment of everything closing in around him. But it was really more about enjoying those ideas of rhythmic cycles that are in Messiaen, and here's something I love to do in my own work, so let's do it even more, and let's expand on that even more in the context of cadences. Some of the harmonies I like to use are not so distant from what Messiaen does in the Quartet for the End of Time, so they don't really seem like these two pieces are at odds with each other. I think they are quite different. I don't know, pretty difficult. I never got much. No one ever complained while not at least to my face, while we were working on the piece. I mean, I think everyone agreed it was difficult, but one thing that was fun is that everyone was really interested in interpretation and phrasing right away, even as they're still trying to navigate the rhythms and the notes and things like that. They're getting down to business of making it music, and not just bookkeeping. And that was incredible to have musicians of that caliber,
Yeah, I think the people involved in this performance are all really, really experienced new music players. Yeah. And that's basically what you do when you get a new piece, is you have to figure out how to make it work. And often it's a language that you've never heard. I don't think anybody except Laura and myself had actually played your music.
No, right.
But that's why we talk about phrasing right from the start, because it's one thing to get the rhythms together. We'll get that eventually, but we have to figure out how to shape it so that it makes sense.
You said nobody complained about how difficult it was.
That's to my face.
I actually asked Reku. I said, "Why?" I asked the pianist, and I said, "That Scott piece, that's rhythmically pretty challenging, isn't it?" And she said, "Messiaen is still harder, a lot harder." Yeah.
Okay.
So you're off to
Well, for those of you who come, it starts out with the speech rhythms, and so you'll have something like this: bum bum dum ba dum bum dee. Da-da-dee. I don't remember exactly how it goes. And maybe even more rests in between. And so we're all kind of very keyed into each other and trying to keep together. But underneath it, if it goes right, there's this kind of pulse that keeps us flowing along, and everything just sort of glides by just the way you would hear someone when they're speaking. That's kind of the objective, but it's actually cannot be achieved unless everyone kind of gets on the same wavelength.
Well, that's it. I mean, it's the rhythm itself might be reproducible by any one person, but to get six to do it
at the same time.
Heartbeat,
yeah, that's right. What was in a moment of bravado at one of the last rehearsals, Laura suggested, "Okay, let's play this but we'll turn our backs to each other," so they couldn't even watch. And you did it. I thought, okay, we're ready. We're ready to do this show. So that was amazing too. I'll never forget that.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing about this collaboration, I don't think it could have worked as well with a text that was by someone who wasn't as granular as Rick is. I mean, you're pretty well known for getting
called many things.
Granular. I used to hate that term, but I've co-opted it now. But someone who gets really deeply into whatever subject he's writing about, and it almost makes the reader want to hear what he's talking about, because it's so specific and so
insightful,
well articulated. And so I think that's what allowed this particular meshing of music and words to work. At least I hope it has. I don't know. We don't want to take the entire
questions or comments or observations. Anyone?
Did you think of trying to write the piece of music that was in the book?
the opera. It's a grand opera. No. Someday maybe.
Slightly larger grants.
Yeah, I would need a larger. Yeah, that'd be a much bigger project. I mean, it's a brilliant idea for an opera. That idea of this insurrection in Münster, in the 17th century, or 15th or 16th or 17th. 16th century it's a marvelous idea, and the way that then became implicated in present day politics, and how that affected the composer. And there have been a number of recent examples of that in our own time, with most notably, Stockhausen and the World Trade Center back in 2001, comments that he made connecting art to that tragedy. And so it was interesting to see that, but that would have been too much, and then I would have needed a librettist. So that would have. So maybe we can talk about that.
So the third strain in your books, in addition to words and music, is genetics.
Yeah.
And so, just think of the Gold Bug variations,
Right.
all three together, and
Right.
this one as well, where your protagonist is a geneticist.
Right.
Or an amateur geneticist.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of curious, what's about that?
I would generalize to say the third strain would be science in general, but life science in particular. And Jonathan made this comment about granularity and taking your subject matter seriously. And a lot of times, when a book is ostensibly about a certain topic, it can be a little bit more like a costume drama, where this is a novel set in the world of science, and that because there's a test tube bubbling in the background somewhere, and somebody's got a white coat on. But to actually say, what if the experiment and the obsession and the particular way of understanding and relating to the world that researcher has would actually be the story. And those passions, the ones that shape the world and that shape us, right? The ones that have made us who we are and given us the luxury to think about self in the ways that we do. If those passions were dramatized in the same way that man against man and man against himself and his spouse, and all those other kinds of things that are the traditional dramas of narrative. If they were treated seriously and brought to center stage, wouldn't that be a more robust picture of the way we live now? And it seems to me, when I was starting out as a young man, to tell the story about humans in the late 20th century and early 21st century, if science and technology aren't center stage, you're not really getting it.
I have a question about, because you, Cornwall told me that that Scott told her that you...
Wait, can you do
that? that you recorded a lot of your text to find the right sort of resonance or sound of, I guess, not only the rhythms, but the meanings, etc. And I just wondered if, I'd like to hear more about that, but also if you had a say in the phrasing of the music, or if you were contributing to that as well.
So I guess this comes out of
I'm talking about the speech record.
Yeah, so for many years I've been writing using voice recognition. And I've done that, I guess, on 4 different novels. And the motivation for that was, it occurred to me that there is a kind of test for authenticity that writers will do. And for those of you who write, you know what I'm talking about. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, you want to hear it out loud at some point. You will either read it to somebody who has to say, "Oh, that's great," or you'll just read it, to yourself, or that just it's kicking the tires in a way. It's hearing explicitly what the reader will be doing when they subaudibly vocalize your text, right? Also, we could use this to kind of come back to this question of the relationship between the way that music means and the way that prose means. But because I am a frustrated musician, I've been extremely conscious my whole life of that degree of meaning, both cognitive and limbic, just the affective component of meaning that accompanies all of semantic meaning, that comes through syntax, that comes through prosody, that comes through just the way the thing sounds. That you need to know that so that the sense and the sonority are consonant, and that they're working in conjunction with each other. So this test of reading it out loud, does it flow? Does it produce suspense, withholding, a forward rush? Does it produce all of the affective components of music that the text is trying to describe? Does it inhabit the thing under description? I thought if you could bring that into the composition part of the process, you would be much more efficient, and you would also potentially have much more leverage as you wrote the thing. If you could hear it as you were composing it, then you would have that subsequent test, and it would be, bringing that revision process into composition would refresh the process. And so I do use that. I use it in conjunction with other modalities when I work, but to shape a sentence so that it doesn't just describe but actually participates in the emotion under description is one of my goals as a writer. And to hear the sentence out loud is the test to see if that's happening or not. I'd like to think so. I don't think I get into any clubs.
He gets to perform this weekend.
Yes, that's right.
That's right.
It's interesting.
Did you have any say in the phrasing of the music? Did you comment on that at all?
No.
No, you let me do what
I don't think they even let you do that too much. Or you said when you work with people who are premiering your pieces, you have to kind of sound out how much is desirable, how much is interesting, how much is useful.
Yeah.
But in this case, it was largely hands-off.
Yeah, I just handed the score to them. What I was saying to Rick, it's one thing to be, in your studio working on the piece, and it's rather solitary, and then it becomes an entirely different thing at that first rehearsal, where it becomes a social activity, and that can be quite a rude awakening in some cases, or it can be thrilling to have a sense of it's getting through, it's communicating. I've had both experiences. I was nervous about this one because I knew the piece was very, very difficult, but I have not really had an opportunity to work with musicians of this caliber in some time. So I thought, what the hell? I'm just gonna go for it, and it was nerve-wracking at first, but to see the piece kind of come together in just 4 days, of rehearsal, the distance it traveled was incredible. So,
But there's a pretty big gap between what you can specify on the page using conventional notation and what you're actually hearing, what you'd like to hear.
yeah, you get better at that and getting those things to come into alignment. But what was wonderful is that I did have some ideas of what I thought I had written. And then when it started coming together, they had some other ideas about how it might go that they just started doing, and it actually, the piece acquired a much more buoyancy and grace as a consequence of that. And that's again, that's a wonderful thing about having that sort of that social dimension of putting the piece together, where it's not just the autocratic composer saying, "Go ahead, make this so," and that it becomes this exchange of ideas, and if something's really difficult, they say, "How about if I add a beat to that measure?" And they say, "You just saved us 20 minutes of rehearsal," and things like that we could do along the way that were both practical, but also really shaped and changed the expressive utterance of the piece as a consequence.
There are different stages. This stage of 4 days of rehearsal leading to a concert is just basically getting up to speed, and we avoided. In a certain way, we avoided certain kinds of considerations. Now, as if we perform it again and then subsequently, there's going to be time to look at the big picture. And I think all of us, in a certain way, are reacting to the same result, which is how it sounds now. And probably things that Scott thought were going to sound a certain way don't sound that way, but that's okay. And now, given the way it sounds now, what can we do to enhance it and make it even better.
There are great moments, by the way, just sort of thought of this in conjunction with Messiaen and his prisoner of war mates, rehearsing in the latrines of the concentration camp, and the player saying, "We'll never be able to play it." And Messiaen says, "You will. You will. Just watch." And trying to show them, and this, but of course, in that case, the composer was one of the players at the premiere as well, so he had a unique position. But you probably worked with composers who were a whole lot more autocratic and who really...
Yes, every composer is different. Some composers have an idea in their head, and the music never sounds the way they wanted it to or imagined it to, and they're never happy. But luckily, that's one end of this. The other end of the spectrum is they have no idea how it's going to sound, or they don't care as long as you're happy. And Scott is pretty exacting, but he's not all the way over on that end of the spectrum. But about this whole question of music's difficulty over time. I realized, having had now a fairly long career, that there are musicians now who are playing music that was written in the 70s and 80s. So young musicians in their 20s and early 30s who, in many ways, execute the music better in general than the original champions of that music. And it's something to do with just the way the music has been absorbed into our culture. I can't really quite put my finger on it. Sometimes I think it's just that 20-something, 30-something musicians have better rhythm because they've just listened to a lot more rock music, with a steady beat. But I don't know.
Or being 12 years old and hearing endless recordings of the classical.
Yeah, but they take it seriously from an earlier age, whatever. But you're getting wonderful performances of Elliott Carter now from groups like Eighth Blackbird and
from teenagers.
From teenagers, right? Which didn't happen in the old days. So there is this evolution, and Messiaen's piece probably was the very limit of what was practical in those days. And nowadays it in a lot of ways is very comfortable. Despite what Riego said, I think it's a very comfortable piece for the audience and for the performers.
But this is not a strictly limited phenomenon. I mean, it goes way back, right? The history of canonical concert music is the history of pieces that were declared unperformable in their day.
Yeah,
and that just get naturalized either because performance, the standard of performance keeps going up, but also because the world just needs a certain number of years to live with something in order to
I think that's
make it comprehensible.
To digest it.
Yeah.
I feel that
Too, right?
To some extent.
Expectation.
Yeah.
If somebody else can do it, if it was written and somebody else can sort of do it, and the next generation goes, well, that's the standard, I'm going to do better.
Right. Mm-hmm. However, you also have, and I think in part of this avant-garde revolution that Orfeo describes and that Scott grew up with, struggling with, there was also this notion, if the history of music is littered with these pieces that were declared unperformable and are now considered masterpieces, then the best way for me to write a masterpiece is to write something that is going to be unperformable.
Right. Great strategy, yes.
But it drove, for a while, a certain kind of uncompromising and relentless music.
And some of those pieces are totally forgotten now. I mean, many of those are, most of them are forgotten. We've just given up. Yeah. Some find their way for whatever reason, will gain a foothold, but others, never did. So it's not a surefire path to
There was
success.
something wrong with the logic from the beginning.
So,
yeah, I mean, I should say, as a musician and a performer of Scott's music, that it's difficult, but not in that way. It's difficult. The challenges are not because there are so many different things happening at once that one can't perceive how it all fits together. What makes it difficult is that there is a very clear way to make it cohesive and hang together. It's just hard to execute it. For instance, the beginning, all 6 of us are playing this rhythm together at the same time. If it happens well, there's nothing confusing at all about it. So, I mean, you're definitely a composer who latches on to to the comprehensible.
Coherent.
I'm looking forward to the performance on Sunday, but I'm wondering how much of it will be playing with simultaneity and temporality and seriality and things like that between the words. Maybe they tend to go over each other? Or
We don't do anything simultaneous. It is more a question, I think, in both cases of framing an actual musical concert experience with a narrative one. Although in the Messiaen we read between movements, which might scandalize some people, right? But it's not that to ask for a kind of polyphony between words and music. Yeah, we did not go in that direction.
And I was reluctant to do that anyway. I often, as I said, I often have trouble with that format because of what I think is sometimes an orthogonality between where words want to pull you and where music wants to pull you. And so setting the words to music, that too, I thought I didn't want to get in the way of this beautiful text. And for me, I mean, I had not met Rick. I had heard radio interviews though with him, and especially that one with Bookworm and Michael Silverblatt, where it's a very, I mean, you're both very eloquent, and to hear Rick speak about his work, I thought this is music in itself. I mean, in just the way that he thinks about words and ideas, and so I didn't want to get in the way of that in my piece, and so to leave it. What was the joyful, or the great thing that happened was just to see, as I said, those words are so beautifully tuned to the pieces that it almost feels like it truly feels like there's a real continuity, an organic continuity from one to the next, which wouldn't always happen. That's not a given in this setting.
It would be polyphonic in the way that, you know, a Bach partita for solo violin is polyphonic, right? You're hearing things.
A compound melody.
Yeah, a compound melody or parallel structures. But you know, I've been involved in projects like that, and I'm sure you've heard projects like that. I'm not saying this is an impediment, but it's a consideration and a complication for verbal polyphony. A lot of people have experimented with this, but I'm thinking about these Glenn Gould radio polyphonic pieces, like the idea of North, where, you know, he was so focused on and committed to performance of highly contrapuntal music, and had this idea that he would like to produce contrapuntal verbal radio, drama. And I've listened to these pieces, and I don't know if anyone else has. They're fascinating, but they make you schizophrenic, because because of the semantic load of words, they carry with them a heavy cognitive processing load. So when you're hearing more than one person speak at the same time, you can, if you're really good, and I suppose growing up with it would probably predispose you to being able to do this, hear vertical, and interesting kind of contrapuntal relationships. But mostly what you hear is 30% of one and 30% of the other. And unlike music, where this is the great leverage of the art form, is that the ear can hear vertically and horizontally at the same time, right? And there isn't a disjunction. So I'm not saying you couldn't. You couldn't produce really interesting contrapuntal or polyphonic verbal, but I think the brain is going to handle it in a very different kind of way.
We never actually considered superimposing words on top of, say, a slow movement of the Messiaen. I'm against that. That would that would just destroy what the music was creating. People do that sometimes, but that's not here.
When we started looking at different texts to have Rick read before Scott's piece, the parallel composition idea that just kept coming into my mind was Samuel Barber and A.G.'s Knoxville Summer 1952. You have to have a writer who is music and a musician who somehow communicates musically deep verbal sentiments. I mean, that's the best way to describe it, And so that piece, I mean, it's a one-of-a-kind piece. It's so magical because both the writing and the music are crossing over into the other universe. And I feel like Rick does that. He does that in all his books, but like I've read every single one of his books, and I feel like
Which is more than I've read, actually.
Orfeo to me is his best way that he uses words, because he knows, because he was writing music in his words, he really was. And there's this whole other section, pre-opera, the section that takes place at the university when Ellis is discovering all this new music and
Right.
he's imagining his own new music. And I just thought, like, this is actually Rick writing music. It really is like, he's so other than words, what he's doing. So, you know, it's really extraordinary, and I keep having this idea that I probably shouldn't tell anybody because they'll be able to steal it. But, you know, this concept, this idea of, you know, music is so abstract, and a piece like the Messian is just, you listen to it now, and it's really the same abstract that it probably always was. There's just a way in which it floats above time and above something that we can't grasp it. We hear it and moves us, but it's just abstract.
It's outside of aesthetic categories in some ways.
Yeah, and Rick's words actually bridle it in a way. And I think that he would be amazing at actually opening the door for people, lay people, on some of the really important major compositions that are written, that audiences will see it on a program like Boulez, and they don't go. But you know, the idea of having a voice like Rick's be able to meld those two worlds is a really incredible thing.
Program notes.
Well, it's the delivery.
It's actually a very fine art and underappreciated art.
Yeah.
Program notes. I'm sure you've all felt this, that the right few paragraphs prior to listening can really key you, and the wrong can do the opposite.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Right.
We actually had a visiting scholar last year, Christian Thorau. Maybe some of you had met him when he was here, whose work is on that, is how to connect audiences with music and the way that music is explained to, how people find their way in. So it's an interesting topic.
Aaron, no.
We may have exhausted ourselves, but if anybody else wants to ask anything.
Well, we hope we'll see you at the concert on Sunday. It should be very special, and it's glad to be able to talk a little bit about the
Thank you
project here.
very much
Yeah.
for coming to hear this, by the way.
Thanks
Thank you very
again.
much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.